Okay. View question, what was it really like to fight in the Civil War? Okay. Usually we think of the Civil War as guns blazing with big wars in the North versus South, but forget to think about how it felt on the average grunt worker. Fighting in the Civil War was terrible because it was very tedious, soldiers were often sick, and everyone was heavily over-medicated. War back then was very tedious. Many soldiers quickly learned that once enlisted, they gave up their lives to constantly be under orders. They learned great discipline, and nowadays, men call that hurry up and wait. So they would, every morning make their beds, clean their little station in their little cabin or tent, and be up and ready in uniform and, soldier-like position and to await orders. The majority of their time was spent drilling or the occasional stint at guard duty, and Robert Watson said in his personal journal, drilled in the afternoon, inspection of arms, commerced drilling, drill as usual morning and afternoon. Soldiers were on the same schedule every single day. When not fighting or on the march, soldiers could relax, and many of them smoked a pipe when they, had their chance and their off time. They also passed the time by gambling on cards and dog and rooster fights. So they would all bet on, who's going to win, dog or rooster. And honestly, I feel like the dog takes the cake every single time, unless you have a little chihuahua, but that's just me. Secondly, you are often sick. When you put thousands of young men in close quarters and limited hygiene facilities, everyone would be sick at one point. Without access to bathing facilities, soldiers used lakes and rivers to keep clean. Back then, they didn't have hand sanitizer or regular washrooms. They would just go in the woods, dig a little hole, and, do their business. And afterwards, they would, maybe cover up the hole, but they wouldn't wash their hands unless there was a river or lake nearby, which sometimes there probably wasn't. So they just had to go back, and do their day-to-day things. So you can imagine how nasty and unsanitary it is and how everyone was getting sick and had poor health. The risk of falling ill was highest for new recruits because they were from rural areas where they were exposed less to disease and had no antibodies to fight from these diseases. They were secluded from everyone else in the world, so they didn't have these antibodies in their bodies to protect them from today's diseases. Just like the Indians, when the new pilgrims came over, they brought all their diseases and illnesses to the Indians who did not have the antibodies, so that's why all the Indians basically died because of disease. Common viruses and infections include typhoid fever, malaria, salmonella, tuberculosis, small and chickenpox, so smallpox and chickenpox, scarlet fever, measles, mumps, and the whooping cough. So all very dangerous things to have unmedicated. Unless you were over-medicated, like many soldiers were. And that brings me to my third point. Soldiers were often over-medicated. Opioids and other drugs were widely available. Drugs were much more common in day-to-day life back then than it is to nowadays. Almost all drugs are really illegal, but back then people sold them in the catalogs, and you could buy them off the streets. They weren't illegal. They were used in medical practices, so people thought they were good, even though they might have not been the best idea. They still sometimes worked. When drafted into the military, doctors commonly used opioids on their patients, and opioids were used to reduce fear and anxiety amongst troops and to help them fall and remain asleep. So it was like an antidepressant, I guess you could say, or a calming thing that men with PTSD could help fall asleep with so they wouldn't have night terrors, or so they could fall asleep, because I guarantee you, with what was going on back then, it must have been quite hard. Drugs commonly used in the Civil War include opium, morphine, Epsom salts, tannin, camarite, alcohol, and many more. The overuse of drugs and boredom made fighting in the Civil War a dull and dangerous experience.